as is our tradition, we are here to talk about what went on in session and of course take any questions any of you may have. You know, I'm proud of some of the things we did this session, and I'm very disappointed in some of the things that happened. As you know, probably the biggest disappointment is how the budget played out. After months of name calling and walking out of rooms and antics, the governor and the Democrats, as Representative Gibran very often talked about, came to a kumbaya at the last minute because that's what they do. And that's fine. If that's where they were, that's where they were. But walking out of here at 3 in the morning with one sheet of paper called a summary, as if we could summarize hundreds of pages of budgets and $1 billion deficit and a $20 billion budget, is not okay. We were hoping that that information would come quickly. It did not. It would trickle in throughout the morning, and by noontime we barely had most of it, but we weren't even close to a document. We weren't even able to caucus it fully. And as I've said before, this isn't about whether we like it or we don't like it, whether it passes or we vote for it or vote against it. It's about the fact that we need to know what it is before we can decide if we like it or we don't like it. We represent 42% of the state of Connecticut, and quite frankly, the rest of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle deserve it too. It's not about us, it's about the people in Connecticut deserve to know what's going on in the light of day, and that wasn't happening. As the day went on, it got worse and worse. And finally, I went into the Speaker's office and we had a very frank conversation, and I'm happy to say that after a lot of thought, he realized that's not how we should do our business. And to their credit, they decided we're not going to do this today. I don't know why, as persuasive as I am, I'm sure it wasn't just my storming in there and raising my voice. You know, we know the old adage, when you have the votes, call it. So I'm not sure what was going on with votes. I know there were a lot of people unhappy with it and unhappy with the process, because I don't think a lot of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle knew the details of that budget either. I know they caucused it, the night before at 9:30 or so, and they came out of there in a half hour. I don't know how you get all that information to 87 people in a half hour. So I don't think that the information had really been disseminated either. But either way, the right thing was done at the end of the day, and I give them credit for that, and I thank them for that. But the process can't continue to work that way. Can't continue to work that way. It's the prerogative of the parties involved in a negotiation to decide if they've come to a conclusion that they want to move forward with, and they did. But it's our responsibility to be able to make proper arguments. And it wasn't about us killing it or filibustering it. It was about having the ability to know what was in it and do our job responsibly. So I'm glad we will be doing that probably the end of the week. When I go into my district, and I'm sure all my colleagues have the same experiences, so what are the big issues this year for session? I mean, I don't mean to diminish what everybody wants in their district, but there's one issue and one issue only, and everything trickles down from that. And you all know we've put out now 4 plans in 11 months. We're very proud, in particular, of our last one with a 5-year plan, because if we don't start looking beyond tomorrow, there will be no tomorrow for the state of Connecticut. 5-year plan is what every business does, what every home does. Very least, they think beyond tomorrow. And we have been doing budgeting based on let's get by tomorrow, and we see where that's gotten us. So I would certainly hope that the powers that be in this building start taking very seriously where we're going, because it's not going to a good place.
Have you been given any indication as to when OFA will produce a full budget for your review?
I have not. I know that there has been blame around the building yesterday as to whose fault it was that there was not a document produced. I have not been told that yet. I will be talking to the speaker either later today or tomorrow to see when we can get that. I would hope it's sooner, because now that we've done the right thing and we push this forward, we all need to be prepared. And I'm not going to get a document on Thursday to do on Friday. So hopefully that'll be quickly.
From what you've seen so far, what are the sticking points for your caucus?
You know, we've gone through it as thoroughly as we can. I think we're going to probably be sitting down over the weekend or Monday and looking at it more clearly, but clearly there's problems with ECS. Clearly there's problems with municipal aid. Social services concerns, they've taken away the COLA for nonprofit providers. What else would you say?
There's some other issues like school transportation funding. They've completely eliminated that. There's substance and mental health grants, psychiatric care for kids. There's a number of areas that are concerning. I appreciate the efforts, but I think we need to really look at those municipal aids. It's not just about MRSA, it's the actual appropriations for the elderly tax relief payments and things like that directly benefiting municipalities that will be significantly reduced.
You know, we've heard since last year when SB 1 was touted and then passed that we need to give towns relief, and that's certainly the case. But as Representative Gibran mentioned, when we talk about municipal aid, the umbrella of municipal aid, it's certainly property tax relief, and you saw in our 5-year plan, we gave the citizens true property tax relief by increasing the property tax credit, which is money that actually goes to each one of you, instead of the big mushroom hanging over the state of Connecticut called, we'll give you money back, you know, and it never happens. So beyond car taxes, you have municipal aid, you have ECS, you have school transportation, you have all of these things that go towards funding towns and cities, not to mention mandate relief and unfunded mandates and being able to vote on whether an unfunded mandate goes through by a supermajority. I mean, these are things that affect towns and cities every day. So just to assume that a car tax cap is going to solve everybody's problems is a very naive and narrow-minded way to look at it.
Dennis, even if you make progress in all these areas, do you think you could deliver many votes from your caucus without a working spending cap as well?
Keith, you know, that's a very good point. We talk about the line-by-line issues, but this ends up being about a much bigger problem that we have been talking about for a long time, structural changes. They continue to refuse to put in a spending cap. They continue to refuse to put in a bonding cap. They continue to refuse to have mandatory voting on union contracts. They continue to refuse to deal with overtime accountability. And the list goes on and on. And so even though we can sit down and talk about, as we did in the last deficit mitigation, we can talk about where we agree and disagree on a line-by-line of FY16, FY17, FY18, and that's certainly an important part of the equation. The big part of the problem, and where the solution is going to be found, and where we're going to be able to move forward as a state, is when we give the state predictability and sustainability, and that trickles down to everybody, to the towns, to our nonprofits. You know, that's where change will be made. Doing these fiscal year deficit mitigations every other month is just, it has to be done, but it's not changing anything. And they get to walk out of this building and say, we did our job, we fixed the deficit, pound their chest, and nothing changes. And that's very misleading to the people of the state of Connecticut.
What happened to the transportation lockbox? I mean, is there...
Well, if there was actually a lockbox that we could have voted on, I'm sure we could have gotten it through. But when you know, I said to the governor several times, I said, I actually feel for you in this situation, because I believe that if he was only negotiating with the Republicans, we could have probably come to a language agreement that could have passed. But his struggle was when you need 3/4 vote to pass something, and you have a minority party of 64 members in the House. If you made the language stronger, which it needed to be, you would have gotten most of our votes. But you would have lost their votes. The language being weaker as it was, got most of their votes and lost ours. And that was a very bad position for him or any of us who truly believe in a constitutional lockbox. But when you have a lockbox that looks great in the front and has a big hole in the back, or has a hole in the front but looks good from the back, or depending on what angle you get it from the side, that's not a lockbox, and that's misleading the state of Connecticut. And even though we are, as politicians, love to say we did this and say we did that, there's no way we were going to be okay voting for something to say we did it and not be able to do anything about it. I mean, it goes back to, if you're going to talk the talk, you better walk the walk. And when we had deficit mitigation back in December, we had the bill, they had the actual audacity to call it, structural changes, and there wasn't one structural change in it. So people really need to focus not on what we're saying, but what we're doing, because those two have to match. And if they don't, you're not being represented properly in the state.
Do you think at the end of the day the Democrats just didn't care about the lockbox this session as much as maybe the governor did?
Honestly, between us, you and me.
Just us girls.
Certainly it wasn't a priority of theirs. I'm not saying there weren't members of theirs that wanted it. But let's be honest here, okay? You talk about a spending cap and a bonding cap. I will not mention who it was, but a leader in this building in the budget negotiations back in the fall, when we were talking about a spending cap, actually said, when we talked about how we thought it should be done, actually said, but Dennis, then if we do it that way, that will tie our hands. Yes, that's the point of it. And therefore, if you want to tell people that of course you support these very good ideas, and who wouldn't support a spending cap, but you don't really want to in your heart, you're not gonna push it. And that's why they weren't interested in it. Although I don't believe they're disingenuous. They don't want their hands tied at the end of the day when we have $220 million deficits and $965 million deficits and $2.2 billion deficits. They want to be able to find that money somewhere. And when you're afraid to make the difficult decisions and the long-term hard structural changes, you're going to get it from wherever you can get it. And when you have impediments such as crazy constitutional spending caps and bonding caps, that limits your ability to play that little shell game that finds money in places you shouldn't find it.
Do you expect, we were told last night that the charge of the call of the session was going to be limited. It was going to be the budget, the supporting legislation, bond cap, and the conveyance bill. But do you expect to see these this legislation loaded up with all sorts of things that either didn't make it or are being included in order to get somebody's support on the budget?
Well, that's always the challenge, right, when you go into special session, because there's more time to play with these implementers, and that is a very narrow call, the way you explained it, Paul. So that is a good thing. But in between now and then, we have to make sure that there's nothing in there that goes beyond what that says. The speaker has assured me that little game they play will not be in there. And I'm not saying that everybody doesn't benefit from that in one way or the other, but right now it is not the time to do anything besides what our obligation is in getting a budget and getting it passed.
Dennis, after what you heard yesterday, what are your thoughts on how easy is it going to be for them to pass this budget? I mean, after talking to Democrats, and your own caucus, are we up for a nightmare? Or is it just going to be quick and easy?
There's always that risk, right? And as we learned from last session's nightmare budget last year, the reason we were kept for 35 hours straight was because they didn't have the votes. And they were afraid if they went home, they would lose even more. So it was the arm twisting and threatening and promising and buying off, et cetera, that got us to calling the budget at 5:30 in the morning. And certainly that's a risk, and I know they were concerned about it, not doing it last night and losing votes. But if we assume they didn't have them in the first place, I would guess that between now and next week there's going to be a lot of phone calls made, a lot of conversations had. But it could be something that takes forever. It could be something that maybe they don't have the votes for. But as we know, they don't call something they don't have the votes for. So I would assume if we walk in there with the intention of voting on it, that it will go through, although we assumed that yesterday too, and we know how that turned out.
Are there any votes in your caucus for it right now?
No.
Dennis, during that brief period between when you got a few pages of numbers and they pulled the plug on it, what kind of amendments were you working on?
Well, we could be here all day talking about that, but we still hadn't decided at the end of the day where we were going with that. But certainly things we've talked about in our budgets that we've done, structural changes, the concerns about ECS, or mental health cuts, or nonprofit providers, school transportation, the things we've already mentioned today that we have serious concerns with, hospitals, disabled population, things that we have stood very strong behind for the past year and a half and in the past, and then put forth in our budget. So those are the things we're talking about, and we will make a decision as we go into that next part of this process.
No, if you ask anybody out there, a lot of people are going to say the legislators failed to do their job last night. Do you think it's fair to include the Republican Party in this, to speak as a whole, or is this something that you think is limited solely to?
Absolutely not, and I'm going to tell you why. Clearly, we all have our part in this process, and no matter how effective we are and how great we believe our budgets are and how much the public supports what we do, the reality is this: the majority is the majority, and they run the building. So if we were in charge, we would have done a budget weeks ago. Weeks ago. So to decide that we're going to fight like children for 2 weeks, call each other every name in the book, and then come out with a deal at whatever time the night before, and then think that you're not going to get most of the people in this building, including your own party, the full document, and have them be prepared to discuss it. We were ready, willing, and able to go forward once we had the documents and we had a reasonable time. We're not talking about 12-hour filibustering, but it would not be unreasonable to talk about a $20 billion budget and a $1 billion deficit for 3 or 4 hours. That's what we did last year in the budget. Reasonable. That's a reasonable time frame. So no, I don't take any blame for it, because we have always been, and we will continue to be, ready, willing, and able to make the tough decisions that are responsible for the state of Connecticut, the things they elected us for. They need to get their stuff together. I mean, this happens way too many times. It happened last year now, it's happening now. And if you can't get your votes and get your organization in order, that blame needs to fall squarely on you.
Could I ask the man about his decision to walk out of finance?
Yes, I would love to hear that.
As someone with a reputation for losing your temper and blowing your stack every minute, could you explain why you did it? And also, was there any message or concern that our overall revenue planning system doesn't work?
Well, enough was enough was basically my statement yesterday. I could not sit through a meeting that clearly, in my opinion, the chairs didn't have a firm grasp on those numbers. And it was really a mockery of the entire process. The other part of the budget that we didn't talk about yet was the revenues. We had an $8 million increase to the cigarette tax with no policy behind it on the basis that people are going to smoke more. Not to be cute, but my thought was, well, if we're gutting the tobacco settlement fund, then maybe that will be why people will be smoking more, because we're not going to be supporting cessation policies any longer. We've had one-time sweeps, again, in this budget that's going to create holes for next year. $40 million for the Attorney General to settle lawsuits. What policy is based behind that? Are we going to encourage the Attorney General now to start going after businesses in Connecticut? So there was just a lot of vague revenue policies that were put into that document. There was not sufficient explanation. The fact that we didn't have a budget to look at to understand these policies, which were also not based on any public hearings that the Finance Committee had. And if we followed the Finance Committee process all year, we were hearing about the car wash tax and the yard goat admissions tax, and these small revenue policies that were the special interest of particular legislators, as opposed to broad tax policy, which this budget needs to be based on. So as a result, we ended up with a lousy document that I think does not reflect what our revenues possibly will look like in the future. And I just felt that a statement needed to be made, that I'm not going to sit in that room and cast a yes or vote on a product that was based on a crumbling foundation.